I don't know how to start this. I've been sitting here for the last 20 minutes, just staring at this old army blanket folded up on the chair in the corner of my bedroom, and I can't make myself put it away. It smells like him still. Or maybe I'm imagining it. Maybe I want so badly for it to still carry something of him that my mind is filling in what my nose can't find anymore. That happens, I've learned. Grief does that to you. It tricks you into believing the person is still close, still reachable, still somewhere just around the corner of the next moment, and then it pulls the rug out and you're on the floor again, and you don't even know how you got there. My name is Sergeant First Class Danielle Reeves, and I've served in the United States Army for 11 years. I've done 2 deployments. I've held dying men's hands in the dirt of places most Americans can't point to on a map. I've written letters home that I didn't know would ever be read. I've been trained to compartmentalize, to push down, to keep moving because the mission doesn't stop for grief, and neither does the enemy, and neither does the clock. I know how to survive loss. That's what I've told myself. That's what I've always believed. But losing Colonel Harold Reeves, my father-in-law, the man who became more of a father to me than my own father ever was, has undone 11 years of that training in a way I cannot explain and have not been able to stop. And the dog. God, the dog. Biscuit was a golden retriever, fat, old, ridiculous, the most undignified creature I've ever loved. Harold used to say Biscuit had the soul of a diplomat and the body of a couch cushion. He'd laugh at his own joke every single time, like he'd never said it before. And every single time, I'd laugh too, not at the joke, but at him laughing. That's the thing nobody tells you about grief. It's not the big things that break you. It's the small, stupid, perfect things. It's the way a man laughs at his own terrible jokes. It's the sound of a dog's nails clicking on hardwood at 6 in the morning because he knows breakfast is coming and he cannot contain his joy about it. It's the smell of coffee and Old Spice and something else that was just Harold, just him, that I can't name and can never recreate. I need to tell this story from the beginning. I need to do it right. Because Harold deserves that. Biscuit deserves that. And, honestly, I need it. I need to say it all out loud, even if nobody hears it, even if it breaks me open in the process. So let me go back. Let me go all the way back to the beginning, to the first time I ever set foot in Harold Reeves' house, terrified and 23 years old, and absolutely certain this man was going to see right through me. I met Marcus Reeves during my 2nd year at Fort Campbell. He was in a different unit, a logistics officer with this ridiculous dimple on one side of his face that he was completely unaware of, which made it twice as charming. We were at a unit mixer, one of those mandatory social events that everyone complains about and then ends up staying at until midnight. Marcus was standing near the punch bowl looking like he'd rather be doing literally anything else, and something about that, the fact that he looked as uncomfortable as I felt, made me walk over and talk to him. We dated for 8 months before he asked me to marry him. And when he did, he also said, somewhat nervously, "My dad wants to meet you. He's a lot. But he's also the best person I know." So, fair warning. I'd heard stories about Colonel Harold Reeves, retired, 26 years of Army service, 2 tours in Vietnam, 1 in the Gulf. A man who ran his household the way he'd run his platoon, which is to say with absolute precision and zero tolerance for nonsense. Marcus loved him fiercely and feared him mildly and talked about him the way people talk about mountains, with a kind of odd respect that acknowledges the mountain doesn't particularly care whether you're impressed or not, but you're impressed anyway. I was terrified. I remember the drive to Harold's house in Clarksville like it was this morning. It was November, early, and the trees had dropped most of their leaves, and the sky was that flat gray color that makes everything look like a photograph of itself. Marcus kept glancing at me and asking if I was okay, and I kept saying yes, I'm fine, and I was absolutely not fine. I was a black woman from South Chicago who'd joined the Army at 19 to escape a situation I didn't talk about, who had no family to speak of, who had spent the last 4 years constructing a version of herself that was competent and capable and didn't need anyone. And I was about to sit across a dinner table from a retired Army colonel who had built his son into one of the finest men I'd ever met, and I was going to have to be enough. We pulled into the driveway, and before Marcus even had the car in park, the front door opened. Harold Reeves was not what I expected. I'd built him up in my mind into something almost severe, tall, rigid, the kind of man whose posture alone could correct yours. And he was tall, yes, and there was something in the way he held himself that spoke of decades of discipline. But what I hadn't expected was the warmth. It hit you before he even smiled. It was in his eyes first, these dark, steady eyes that when they landed on you made you feel like you were the only thing in his field of vision. And then there was Biscuit. Biscuit exploded out of the door the second it opened, 70 pounds of golden retriever chaos, scrambled down the porch steps with absolutely no regard for physics, and launched himself at Marcus with the enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting his entire life for this specific moment. Marcus went down on one knee in the driveway, laughing, and Biscuit licked his face with the dedication of a man who has a job to do and intends to do it thoroughly. Harold stood on the porch and looked at me. "You must be Danielle," he said. "Yes, sir," I said. 11 years of Army training, and those were the only 2 words I could produce. He looked at me for a moment. Not sizing me up, or not only that. It felt more like he was seeing me. Like he was doing something more careful than judgment. "Good," he said. And then he smiled. "Come inside. I made too much food." That was it. That was the whole introduction. And somehow, in those 4 words and that smile, every bit of terror I'd been carrying dissolved. Not completely, but enough. Enough for me to walk up those porch steps and into that house and into 11 years of the most unexpected, unasked for, desperately needed love I have ever received in my life. Harold's house smelled like coffee and wood smoke and something baked. He'd made cornbread, I found out, because Marcus had mentioned once, years ago, that I'd said I liked cornbread, and Harold had filed that away and produced it on the day he met me. That's who he was. He listened to things people didn't realize they'd said, and then he remembered them, and then he did something about it quietly, without fanfare, without ever asking for credit. Dinner that first night was the 3 of us and Biscuit, who stationed himself under the table with the focused determination of a dog who has learned that patience and strategic positioning are the foundations of a successful career in food acquisition. Harold served pot roast and cornbread and green beans from a recipe he said was his mother's, and we talked for 3 hours. Harold asked me questions. Not interrogation questions, not the kind that feel like they're testing you for weaknesses. They were real questions. He asked about where I grew up, and when I gave him the short version, the safe version, he nodded and didn't push. He asked what I liked about the Army, and I told him the truth, that it had given me a structure I'd never had, a family I'd never expected, a sense of myself that I'd had to fight to find. He listened to all of that without interrupting, without offering his own experience as a counterpoint, just listened. And then he said, "The Army gives some people their life back. I'm glad it did that for you." I didn't cry. I wanted to. But I'd spent years learning not to, and the habit held. After dinner, Harold made coffee, real coffee, the kind you grind yourself, and we sat in the living room while Biscuit arranged himself across Harold's feet like a living blanket and sighed the sigh of a creature in complete and total contentment. Harold caught me watching Biscuit and said, "He thinks he's a lapdog. Has thought so since he was 8 weeks old." I've never had the heart to correct him. "How old is he now?" I asked. 4, Harold said. "Same age he'll be in his own mind for the rest of his life." Marcus laughed. I laughed. Harold smiled his steady smile. I drove home that night thinking, I understand now. I understand exactly why Marcus is who he is. Because he was raised by that man. He was shaped by that particular kind of love, the kind that doesn't make noise about itself, the kind that shows up in cornbread and real coffee and questions that mean I want to know you. I called my mother that night. We didn't have a good relationship. We never really had, but I called her and I told her I'd met Marcus's father, and she asked what he was like, and I thought for a moment and I said, "He's the kind of father I would have wanted." There was a silence on the other end of the line. "Well," my mother said, "that's something." It was everything. Marcus and I got married the following June. A small ceremony at Fort Campbell with a reception that Harold organized with the precision of a military operation and the warmth of a man who had been planning it in his heart since Marcus first told him about me. Harold walked me down the aisle. My father was not in my life, hadn't been since I was 11, and when Harold offered, quietly, the week before the wedding, I said yes before I'd even finished processing the question. He offered his arm as we stood outside the chapel doors, the June heat already pressing down, and he looked at me and said, "You don't have to call me anything in particular. But I'd like it if you thought of me as yours." I almost lost it right there on the chapel steps. I held it together, barely, and I squeezed his arm and I said, "I already do." He nodded once, the way he always did when something mattered too much for more words, and then the doors opened and we walked. That moment, that specific moment, his arm under my hand, the sun coming through the chapel windows, the sound of Marcus's breath catching when he saw me, that is the moment I return to most often now. When the grief gets very bad and the nights are very long, I go back there. I stand in that doorway. I feel Harold's arm. And I breathe. The years between that wedding and now are not a blur exactly. They're more like a series of vivid photographs, images that snap into focus when I call them up, each one so clear it almost hurts. Harold at Thanksgiving, carving the turkey with the focused expression of a man performing surgery. Harold at the hospital when Marcus had his appendix out, sitting in the waiting room with a cup of terrible vending machine coffee and a paperback novel he wasn't really reading, just needing something to do with his hands. Harold on video call when I was deployed, careful never to show worry on his face, careful to keep his voice even, telling me about Biscuit's latest misadventures, the time he'd gotten into the pantry, the time he'd dragged Harold's reading glasses outside and buried them in the backyard with what Harold described as a level of satisfaction that I found frankly insulting. He always led with Biscuit on those calls. I figured out why, eventually. He knew that talking about the dog kept things light. He knew I needed light. He knew that hearing about Biscuit stealing socks or refusing to come inside during rainstorms or sitting at Harold's feet while Harold watched the evening news. He knew those stories were like a hand reaching through the screen to remind me that there was a world outside the deployment, a world that was still ridiculous and warm and good, and that it was waiting for me. He was protecting me, even from 6,000 miles away. That was Harold. Biscuit turned 9 the summer before Harold got his diagnosis. We had a small party, Marcus's idea, fully committed to without irony by everyone present. Harold baked a dog-safe cake, which he'd found a recipe for online, which Marcus and I teased him about mercilessly. And Biscuit ate it in approximately 45 seconds, and then sat looking at us with an expression that said, "Is that all?" with a clarity that needed no translation. Harold took a picture of Biscuit with the remnants of the cake on his nose. He printed it out and put it on the refrigerator. I saw it there every time I visited, right up until the end. The diagnosis came in October. Pancreatic cancer. Stage 3. Catching it relatively early, the doctors said, which felt like the cruelest possible use of the word early that I'd ever encountered. Treatment began almost immediately, chemotherapy, a surgery they hoped would help, more chemotherapy. Harold faced it the way he faced everything, with a steady, unemotional practicality that was somehow both admirable and heartbreaking in equal measure. He didn't make a big announcement. He called Marcus, and Marcus told me, and we drove to Clarksville the next day and sat at Harold's kitchen table while he walked us through the treatment plan as though he were briefing us on an operation. He had the doctor's notes. He had a list of questions he'd already asked and the answers he'd received. He had a timeline. "The prognosis is uncertain," he said. "That's the honest truth. But I intend to be difficult about this." Marcus said. "Dad, I intend," Harold said, firmly, "to be extremely difficult about this." He looked at both of us. "So I'd appreciate it if you'd take your cues from me rather than from statistics." Biscuit, perhaps sensing the weight of the moment, chose this point to heave himself up from his dog bed in the corner and cross the kitchen and put his head in Harold's lap. Harold rested his hand on Biscuit's head automatically, without looking down, the gesture of a man and a dog so long in each other's company that it required no thought. It was pure reflex. Pure love wearing the clothes of habit. I looked at that and I thought, whatever happens, that's real. That has been real. No one can take that. I believed it then. I still believe it now, even when the grief says otherwise. The next 18 months were the most difficult of my life, and I have had a life that has not been short on difficulty. I want to be honest about that. I want to say it plainly because I think there's a version of this story where I wrap it in too much grace, where I make it beautiful instead of true, and Harold would not have wanted that. He believed in the truth. He used to say, the truth is heavy, but at least it's solid. You can stand on it. So, the truth. The treatment was brutal. Harold lost weight, the man who had always been solidly built, who moved with the quiet assurance of someone comfortable in his body, became someone I had to pretend not to notice changing. His hair thinned. His appetite went. He got tired in a way that was nothing like ordinary tiredness. It was a bone-deep exhaustion that I could see pressing down on him from the inside. And through all of it, he never stopped asking about us. Never stopped asking about Marcus's work, about my unit, about what was happening in our lives. He would be sitting in his recliner with a blanket across his lap, the army blanket, the one that's on my bedroom chair right now, and he would ask me questions with the same focused attention he'd always had, and I would answer them. And then I would go home and sit in my car in the driveway and cry until I couldn't breathe. That's the thing about loving someone who is dying with grace. Their grace makes your grief harder to hold, because it feels indecent to be broken when they're being so whole. But grief doesn't care about decency. It comes when it comes. Biscuit was 11 by then, old for a big dog, gray around the muzzle and slower on the stairs. He knew something was wrong. Animals always know. He had never been a dog who chose one person over all others. He'd always been generous with his affection, lavish about it, democratic in his devotion. But in those last months, he chose Harold. He didn't leave Harold's side. When Harold slept, Biscuit slept beside him. When Harold moved from room to room, Biscuit was his shadow, warm and golden and always there. Harold used to joke that Biscuit had appointed himself head of security, but I think it was something older than that, something that didn't have a name in human language, a kind of vigil. A keeping of company at the most essential level. I have thought about this many times since. I have thought about what it meant that an old golden retriever understood something in those months that Harold wouldn't say out loud. That Biscuit, who had no language for mortality, no framework for it, nonetheless chose to be present for it in the most complete way he knew how, with his whole body, with his warmth, with his steady breathing beside Harold in the night. There is no translation for that kind of love. There is only the fact of it. Harold had a good day in February. A genuinely good day. He was up early, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table when we arrived, and he looked more like himself than he had in months. His eyes were clear. He was hungry. He ate actual breakfast, which had been rare, and he made fun of the morning news with the cheerful contempt he'd always had for it, and for a few hours it felt like before. It felt like we could pretend. After breakfast, he said he wanted to sit outside. It was cold, February cold, but he wanted to sit on the back porch, and we brought him a coat and the army blanket, and he sat in the old wooden chair that had been on that porch since Marcus was a child, and Biscuit lay at his feet. And Harold looked at the backyard, the bare trees, the gray sky, the ground still hard with winter, and he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I want to talk to you, Danielle. Just you for a minute." Marcus went inside. Biscuit didn't move. Harold looked at me with those steady eyes, and he said, "You came into this family without a net. You had no one backing you up. And you stood anyway. I want you to know I saw that. I saw it from the first night." I couldn't speak. I just looked at him. "Marcus is going to need you," he said. "You know that. But I also need you to know that when the time comes that you need to put yourself back together, that's allowed. Grief has a way of telling people they should be stronger than they are. Don't listen to it." "Harold," I started. "I'm almost done," he said, gently. "I want you to keep the blanket. When I go, I want you to have it." He touched the edge of the army blanket folded across his lap. "It's been with me a long time. It should go somewhere it'll be used." I was crying by then. I wasn't trying not to. He reached out and put his hand over mine, and he said, You were the daughter I didn't know I was going to get. And I got you late, and I didn't have long enough with you, and am angry about that. But I'm glad. I'm glad I got to know you at all. I put my head down on our joined hands, and I cried the way I'd never let myself cry in front of anyone. Harold kept his hand on mine and let me. He didn't try to stop it or fix it or tell me it would be okay. He just held on. Biscuit lifted his head and rested his chin on Harold's knee and looked at me with his old brown eyes, and I had the strangest feeling, the kind that doesn't make rational sense and that I haven't been able to shake, that Biscuit understood. That he was there, steady and warm, for both of us. Harold died on a Tuesday in March. Early morning, before the sun was fully up. Marcus was there. I was there. It was peaceful, or peaceful enough. The body doesn't always cooperate with peace at the end, and I won't pretend Harold's did entirely. But he wasn't alone, and he wasn't in pain, and his last coherent words, the day before, had been to ask Marcus if he'd eaten and to tell me that the coffee in the hospital was criminal and someone should do something about it. That was Harold. To the end. Biscuit was at home. We'd had a neighbor come stay with him. I've always felt a particular ache about that Biscuit wasn't there, that Harold's shadow wasn't beside him for the last crossing. But then I think, maybe it was right. Maybe the mercy of it was that Harold could let go a little easier without those brown eyes watching him, without having to say goodbye to the creature who had been his most constant companion for 11 years. We brought Harold home. We brought his things home, and Biscuit was waiting at the door. He looked at Marcus. He looked at me. He looked past us both, toward the car, toward the driveway, toward the space where Harold wasn't. And he made a sound I have never heard a dog make before or since. Not a howl. Not a whine. Something smaller and older than either of those things. Something that was just recognition. Absence. The specific sound of understanding that the thing you loved is not coming back. I sat down on the floor right there in Harold's entryway, and I pulled Biscuit into my arms, and I held him, and he let me, and we stayed like that for a long time, the two of us, in the house that still smelled like Harold, like coffee and wood smoke and Old Spice. And I thought, we are the ones who are left. We have to hold this for each other now. The months after Harold's death were the strangest months of my life. Grief is not what they show you in movies. It's not a clean, linear progression from shock to sadness to acceptance. It's more like weather, unpredictable, relentless, capable of going from bright sun to a storm without any warning at all. I would be fine for days, genuinely functional, managing the funeral arrangements, helping Marcus sort through Harold's things, returning to duty with the competence that the army expected of me. And then something small would hit me, and I would be completely undone. A specific smell. The sound of a dog's nails on a floor. A morning where the coffee was particularly good, and I thought, automatically, Harold would like this, and the thought had nowhere to go. Marcus grieved differently than I did. More quietly, more inward. He had the long practice of having had Harold his whole life, the complicated geometry of a son's love for a father, which includes a lifetime of tension and repairs and moments of failure on both sides, not just the clean, uncomplicated love I'd been given. His grief had more texture to it, more layers. I tried to hold space for that, to not make my grief compete with his, to remember that I had been given 11 years, and he had been given 34, and that the calculus of loss isn't simple. But I will be honest, there were nights when Marcus's way of being in his grief made me feel alone in mine. Made me feel like my version of loving Harold was smaller or less legitimate, like I'd arrived late to the story and therefore shouldn't grieve as hard. Those nights were the worst. Those were the nights I'd go into the guest room, Harold's room, when he'd stayed with us, and I'd sit on the edge of the bed with the army blanket around my shoulders, and I'd talk to Harold. Out loud. In the dark. Just talking. I know that probably sounds strange. I'm not a particularly spiritual person. I don't know what I believe about what comes after. But those conversations felt necessary. They felt like they were doing something. I told Harold about my day. I told him about the things at work that were frustrating me. I told him about a decision I was trying to make and asked what he thought. I didn't hear answers. But I don't have a better word for this, I felt heard. The way you feel heard when you write something down, when the act of putting it into words does something to it. Biscuit, on the nights I did this, would come find me. He had always been able to find people in the dark, some golden retriever superpower, some gift. He'd come into the room and hop up on the bed, slowly, effortfully. He was old and his hips were going, and he'd put his head in my lap. And we'd sit there together, Biscuit and I, in Harold's guest room, me talking to someone who wasn't there, Biscuit keeping me company the way he'd kept Harold company, with his whole warm self. I want to say something about Biscuit here that I haven't been able to say to anyone out loud yet, because it makes me sound crazy, and I know it makes me sound crazy. Biscuit died 4 months after Harold. The vet said it was his heart. He was 11 and a half, and his heart gave out, and the vet said it was peaceful, that he went quickly, that he didn't suffer. I believe all of that. I believe the medical facts. But I also believe, and I have believed this since the moment it happened, and I can't shake it, and I don't want to shake it, that Biscuit waited. I believe he stayed as long as he could, just long enough to see us through the worst of the immediate grief, just long enough to make sure we were going to be okay. And then he went to find Harold. I know. But I also know that dog. I knew that dog for 11 years. I know what he was. And a dog who appointing himself head of security in the last months of the man he loved, a dog who made that sound in the doorway, a dog who spent 4 months pressing his warmth against my leg in the dark while I talked to someone he couldn't see. That dog was not just a dog. He was the most Harold thing left in the world after Harold was gone. He was Harold's love with a heartbeat and a tail. And when the heartbeat stopped, when the tail went still, the thing that hit me hardest was not just losing Biscuit. It was losing the last living piece of Harold. I have the blanket. It's on the chair in the corner of my bedroom. I have the photograph from the refrigerator, Biscuit with cake on his nose, eyes bright, looking at Harold behind the camera with pure, uncomplicated joy. I have a pocket watch Harold gave me the Christmas before he died, quietly, slipping it into my coat pocket and saying only, it was my father's. It should belong to someone who'll use it. I have Marcus, who carries his father in his dimple and his coffee ritual, and the way he listens when I talk, really listens, the way Harold taught him. And I have this story. This long, imperfect, necessary story that I have needed to tell for months, that I have been carrying like a stone in my chest, and have finally put down. Harold used to say that people don't really die as long as someone is still telling their story. He believed that. He was a man who read history because he genuinely believed the dead deserved to be heard. He said once, every person who ever lived was the center of their own universe. They had their own fears and their own loves and their own version of the world. The least we can do is remember that. So this is me remembering. This is me saying, Harold Reeves existed. He was specific and real and stubborn and warm. He made cornbread for a woman he'd never met because his son had mentioned, once, that she liked it. He told terrible jokes about his dog. He walked a fatherless girl down the aisle in the June heat and made her feel, for the first time in her life, like she belonged to someone. He faced his death with a steady practicality that broke everyone else's hearts while his remained, at least outwardly, whole. He was a soldier, and he was a father, and he was mine, and I loved him. And Biscuit. God. Biscuit of the cake nose and the diplomatic soul and the couch cushion body. Biscuit who pressed his warmth against Harold's feet for 11 years. Biscuit who waited and then went to find him. I smell them both sometimes. In this blanket. In the guest room. In a particular quality of morning light that I can't explain. I know it's grief doing what grief does, filling in the absence with the memory of presence. I know that. But some part of me, the part of me that held Biscuit in Harold's entryway, the part of me that talked to Harold in the dark and felt heard, that part of me thinks it might be something more. I don't know what I believe.